protecting the world we share. Global leaders take a stand on climate change.
Extreme weather cost America last year $99 billion.
New weather patterns, rising water, and rising temperatures are damaging the smallest of the ecosystem's food chain.
If we didn't have the biological pump, then the atmospheric carbon dioxide would be 50% higher than it is now.
The search for strategies and solutions to this growing crisis. Now, on the Inside Story, Our Changing Climate. Hi, I'm VOA correspondent Carolyn Pursuti, reporting from the National Arboretum in Washington, D.C. This 450-acre site is where the Department of Agriculture conducts its botanical research. We're here because the Earth's environment is in danger due to climate change. Oh yes, I know that there are shifts in the world's climate that occur naturally. But as the world industrialized, climate change rose dramatically. America's space agency, NASA, charts how much the world's surface temperatures have increased and how fast it took place. 19 of the last 21 years, did you catch that? 19 of the last 21 years were the hottest on record. That impact can be measured in the frequency and increased intensity of hurricanes and wildfires, not just here in the US, but around the world. Our Henry Ridgwell begins our coverage from London.
On the Greek island of Evia, residents flee their homes beneath a sky of burning red as fires consume pristine forests turned to tinder by searing summer heat. This is just one of hundreds of intense fires burning across Greece, Turkey and Italy as summer temperatures have topped 45 degrees Celsius. The message from scientists: climate change is here.
The Mediterranean will be having these forest fires all the time. Therefore, this is just the beginning. It's going to get much worse.
Intense heat and drought have triggered fires from the Mediterranean to Siberia to California. The report, compiled by 200 scientists from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, says temperatures have already risen by 1.1 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. The United Nations Secretary General described the findings as code red for humanity.
This report tells us that each of the past 4 decades has been the warmest on record since pre-industrial times. Further, it is indisputable that human activities are causing climate change. Human influence is making extreme climate events, including heat waves, heavy rainfall, and droughts, more frequent and severe.
The report warns that global average temperatures will hit 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels by 2030 on current trajectories, the limit agreed at the Paris Climate Summit in 2015 and seen as a tipping point by many scientists. That's 10 years earlier than previous forecasts. The report adds that sea level rises of up to 2 meters by the end of the century can't be ruled out, threatening millions of people living in coastal areas. And the Arctic is likely to see at least one ice-free summer by 2050. But scientists emphasize there is a way out. The worst scenarios can be prevented and global warming reversed with drastic cuts to global emissions.
These aren't just small changes we can make. These aren't just sort of tinkering at the edges. These really mean whole-scale changes of the way we use and consume energy. Carbon dioxide is the main one, which we need to get to zero emissions by the middle of the century. But we've also shown that methane is an important gas to reduce. It's caused maybe as much as 0.5 degree of the warming we've already seen.
With the United States rejoining the Paris Climate Agreement under President Joe Biden, scientists hope there will be added momentum as world leaders gather in November for the COP26 Global Climate Summit in Britain. Biden's envoy for climate, John Kerry, said Monday that all major economies must commit to aggressive climate action during this critical decade.
It's actually commissioned by the world's governments, this report. So we're providing information that they want, that they say they need to make political decisions.
Those decisions will decide whether humanity can avert catastrophic climate change. Its impact is already being felt in many parts of the world. Henry Ridgewell for VOA News, London.
President Biden has already committed the United States to cutting its carbon emissions by at least 50% by the year 2030. While touring areas damaged by recent hurricanes and wildfires, Biden says the disasters are, quote, a blinking code red for the environment. VOA's White House correspondent Anita Powell explains.
Raging fires, howling hurricanes, rising floodwaters. You're not imagining it, says U.S. President Joe Biden. The weather is changing in scary and unpredictable ways, with hurricanes, floods, and wildfires all ravaging swaths of the continental U.S. This week, he is touring wildfire-affected areas and making his plea to the American people.
Extreme weather cost America last year $99 billion. Let me say it again. Extreme weather in the United States cost the United States of America a total of $99 billion. And this year, unfortunately, we're going to break that record. It's a devastating loss to our economy and for so many communities.
His solution, a juggernaut $3.5 trillion spending plan that will, among other things, invest in clean energy and green vehicles and reduce the country's dependence on polluting industries. That bill has passed the House, but now it's up to the 100 Americans in the Senate. Environmental advocates are watching closely and say one concern is that these bills are full of other contentious items that could slow their passage.
The reconciliation package is not just climate change, it's also a series of social programs, and we don't know, where that will come down. And so it could be clean energy advocates who are disappointed, it could be social program advocates who are disappointed, or some combination of the two.
But advocates argue this is urgent. Parts of the country are literally on fire.
As we've been seeing over the last summer and really the last couple of years, with natural disasters across the country getting worse, wildfires in the West, hurricanes in the Gulf, and the information that has been coming out of our top science bodies that climate change is here and it is continuing to get worse. And we have a vanishingly small window to act and reverse those impacts.
The bill's opponents raise a number of objections, that there are cheaper ways to spur green energy, that traditional industries like coal will see job losses, and that the bill's price tag is just too high.
It's not hard to see that another $3 or $4 trillion of government debt is really not good for the federal government. I think it would get us closer to a financial crisis. We have to remember that 10 years ago, numerous countries like Greece and Italy got into serious government, financial and economic crises because the government borrowed too much money. I fear the United States is going in that direction.
So now what? Biden says he's determined to pass this legislation despite hurdles in Congress. Republicans are united in opposition, and even some Democratic lawmakers have misgivings. In coming weeks, the Senate will decide. Anita Powell, VOA News, Washington.
Earth's rising temperatures are causing the polar ice caps to melt faster. NASA tracks that rate of change in both the Greenland and Antarctic ice sheets. We're losing more than 1 billion tons of ice every day. Consider what happens. Melting ice causes sea levels to rise. Well, that water has to go somewhere. So we asked NASA to help us understand where that water is going and what it could do to the Earth.
My name is Paul Lundgren, and I'm a research scientist at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. In the last say 5 years or something like that, we've been increasingly looking into the effects of mostly man-made effects, although they could be climate change or other effects that are kind of indirectly caused by people, whether it's melting of glaciers or extraction of groundwater, or even more or less what we call surface water or near surface water due to rainfall. All of that, the effect is that it's changing the load on the earth. So the amount of mass, the weight of the water, that's a change in stress that can affect the stresses on faults that can therefore affect seismicity. And then another effect that's less well known is to what extent can water follow large cracks, which really ultimately means potentially faults, to sufficient depth that it somehow affects earthquakes as well. In the case of Iceland, you have ice that's covering a kind of a broad mountain, but as that ice melts and thins and it releases the weight of the ice on the subsurface, and that is causing changes in forces deep underground in the upper crust, on the upper 15 kilometers depth. And there has been suggestion that some recent increases in seismicity there are just due to the release of this weight from ice melting. By understanding these changes that are occurring due to climate or due to water, we can use them to kind of interrogate the physics of what's happening. So you can then better fine-tune the models in general, potentially, to understand these processes.
Here in Washington, climate change is one of the major issues facing Congress as lawmakers struggle to pass new policies. But drive 3 hours south from here, and residents along Virginia's eastern shore are not waiting for Washington to act. Local wildlife experts are trying to slow and perhaps reverse the damage already done to shorelines. Reporter Veronica Balderas Iglesias takes us inside the work of marine coastal conservation. Here are her 2 reports from Gloucester Point, Virginia.
Inside a mesh bag on Virginia's eastern shore is a gurgling answer to climate change. Scientists submerged oysters in a bed of seagrass, an experiment to see if underwater plants, which naturally absorb carbon dioxide, can protect them. You see, oceans are turning warmer and more acidic, thanks to humans burning fossil fuels. And this is hurting not just oysters, but the bountiful ecosystems around them.
Acidification occurs because the carbon dioxide we're adding to the atmosphere dissolves partly in the ocean and forms a weak acid. Any shell-forming creature has a more difficult job forming its shell in an ocean that's more acidic.
At stake is the destructive impact on marine life and the delicate food chains that sustain the world's fisheries. Take creatures called theropods. These tiny sea snails populate all the world's oceans and are a precious food for salmon and many important fish. But in acidic ocean waters, their shells dissolve. Scientists are studying ocean acidification, often called climate change's evil twin. At the Virginia Institute of Marine Science, Professor Emily Rivest runs experiments on oysters.
When we have that combination of warming and acidification, we see the most dramatic negative effects on the larvae. So they don't form their shell properly and they don't eat as well.
The experiments help aquaculture in the Chesapeake Bay. The massive estuary suffers from coastal acidification caused in part by heavy rains and fertilizer runoff. Michael Congrove owns a commercial oyster hatchery.
Where it becomes really tricky is when we have periods of poor water quality that we're not able to solve with our filtration solutions, and that can really put a dent in our production.
If these steps fail, oyster farmers like Brandon Eanes are at risk. He buys seed from hatcheries to sell for wholesale distribution.
You put them in these tanks and they grow.
Yes, ma'am. They put them in these tanks until they grow, until they're about ½ an inch. Something big enough that we can put in this bag.
Ince is skeptical of human-made climate change, but he concedes that something in the past 10 years has shifted.
We have oysters grow in December. That's kind of not normal. They're not growing much, but as it gets warmer, I think, if anything, the calendar's shifted. If climate change is man-made, I would hope that man would be smart enough to stop doing what he's doing to have adverse effects.
At the end of June, a record heat wave had catastrophic effects for shellfish in the Pacific Northwest and Canada. At least 1 billion mussels died, says Elisa Gaiman, a marine ecologist at the Hakai Institute. Get used to it, scientists say, and the impacts will go beyond shellfish to marine life critical for tourism.
And I've been to places where the health of the corals is clearly diminished, starting with South Florida, parts of the Mexican Yucatan, much of the Caribbean, certainly parts of the Pacific also.
What can be done? Back to our patch of seagrass.
If you can promote the growth of seagrasses, they might actually benefit and have been shown to benefit, for instance, corals that are growing around them. The real solution is to reduce emissions around the globe.
An enormous problem for global leaders. But it's not stopping Todd Janeski from taking small steps. Janeski, with the Virginia Commonwealth University, is part of a multilateral effort to restore oyster habitat by recycling their own shells.
Those larval oysters grow on that shell and we put it onto restoration projects. We're seeing improvements in water clarity. We're seeing aquatic grasses nearby. By creating the habitat for oysters, what we have is a habitat for other animals as well.
Janeski has demonstrated the process to experts from Europe, Australia, and Asia. He says they are coming to recognize the value of oysters in the global fight against climate change. So, the lowly oyster may not be so lowly after all.
This is Goodwin Island in Virginia. You can see here down the coastline that is slowly eroding. And then if you look off this way, there is the salt marsh that is slowly replacing the forests that were once there.
Scientist Tyler Messerschmidt explains that trees cannot live in the wet, salty ground from sea level rise and storm surges in the York River. Because of climate change caused by humans, the water is getting warmer and expanding. Where thriving trees once stood guard, he says we have ghost forests, and they make climate change even worse.
These forests are great stores of carbon that are there, and as those trees slowly die, that carbon is returned, some of it to the natural system, including the atmosphere, which also leads to possibly more global warming through climate change.
Marshes like these help keep the base clean. They protect against the wrath of hurricanes, but they too are drowning. They have the capacity to migrate inland to protect themselves, but development along the coastlines is leaving them nowhere to go.
Bangladesh, parts of India, Thailand, a lot of Thailand, Myanmar, Vietnam. These have large stretches of marshland, which is in the tropics. Mangroves are a dominant species, and we're eroding away the base of those systems.
I'm going to go ahead and lower the net.
Scientist Deborah Steinberg tows nets to collect samples of other organisms that are relocating because of climate change.
Oh, you can see them. Yeah, so those are copepods, rice grain size crustaceans, and they're sort of a central part of the ocean food web.
In what's called the biological pump, they help sink carbon dioxide, the main global warming gas, to the depths of the ocean.
If we didn't have the biological pump, then the atmospheric carbon dioxide would be 50% higher than it is now. And if we have higher carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, that causes more of a greenhouse effect, and that's more warming.
The warming has changed where these marine drifters operate.
We have tropical and subtropical plankton that are expanding their range away from the equator, and then the subpolar and polar species, their ranges are contracting. A lot of the tropical, subtropical plankton are smaller, and so they're not as efficient at transporting the carbon.
Scientists around the world are monitoring these negative effects of climate change. They are also working hard to help nature heal itself. As part of the efforts to restore foundation habitats, scientists collect seeds from seagrasses to use in restoration projects. The species known as eelgrass also absorbs carbon. It was once abundant in the Chesapeake Bay, but it's dying back from high temperatures. Biologist Christopher Patrick and his team are hunting for answers.
Rather than just plant eelgrass, we're also planting another species. And that species is another native seagrass that's in the Chesapeake Bay called widgeon grass, and it can handle high temperatures.
The ultimate hope is that the two species will help each other survive and protect other creatures at the same time.
Juvenile fish and crabs, they have higher abundance, they have faster growth rates, and they survive better in the grass beds than outside of the grass beds. And so it's performing this really important service for the fisheries.
During the fall of 2021, widgeon grass seeds will be planted for the first time on a large-scale restoration project near Virginia Beach. It's a project that could be a model for ailing shorelines around the world. Verónica Valderas Iglesias for VOA News, Gloucester Point, Virginia.
Planting eelgrass may be the answer, but it requires a lot of other solutions that need to be discovered and applied for it to work. Take, for example, the foundation of the industrialized society, right here at my feet. Concrete. The problem is, concrete creates one of the largest groups of greenhouse gas emissions ever. But we need concrete, not only to build and rebuild houses and sidewalks and hospitals and bridges. Everything needs concrete. VOA's Steve Baragona takes a look at how we can lessen the load of concrete.
These are no ordinary concrete blocks. They're made by a company called Carbon Built with a special recipe and baked in a special oven. Gaurav Sant is Carbon Built's founder.
What makes them different from the convection oven that you have at home is that we put in carbon dioxide in the form of flue gas. Think about the emissions from the smokestack of a power plant. That's what we put into our convection oven. And they come out at the end infused with carbon dioxide.
That carbon dioxide is locked away forever inside those blocks. That's important because making concrete generates a lot of CO2. Concrete is a mix of stone and sand held together with cement. Making cement involves burning limestone at 1500 degrees Celsius. The flame creates CO2, but the hot limestone itself releases even more. Every ton of concrete generates a ton of CO2. And demand for it is soaring with the growing population, says University of Michigan Global CO2 Initiative Director Volker Sick.
If we then do not find ways to make concrete in a more benign way, we do have a problem.
One more benign way? Carbon Built is one of several companies that have modified their recipes so that the cement takes up carbon dioxide. That does more than just keep the CO2 out of the atmosphere, says Carbon Cure President Jennifer Wagner.
That the CO2 also acts as a strengthener of the concrete. So by adding the CO2, they can achieve the desired strength with less cement.
Less cement means less CO2, but also saves money. That can help win customers, Wagner says.
Everybody wants to build green, but they don't necessarily want to pay more.
The process can cut carbon emissions in half in some cases. Carbon Built and Carbon Cure recently won the Carbon X Prize for turning CO2 emissions into market-ready products. It's a good start, says Volker Sick.
I think it showcases the potential. It's ready to be implemented everywhere now. We have ways to go.
Right now, we have about 300 concrete plants around the world who are using the technology every day. There are about 100,000 plants out there. So we really are just scratching the surface.
The technology is starting to make inroads. Another company, Solidia, is selling concrete pavers that use a similar process. But concrete is the most abundant human-made material on Earth, so there's a long way to go to lighten its heavy climate impact. Steve Baragona, VOA News.
And that's all the time we have today. Make sure you follow the climate change issue on voanews.com and connect at VOA News on Instagram and Facebook. I'm Carolyn Pursuti in Washington. Join us next week for The Inside Story.